Vladimir Putin thought he had it all figured out as Russia entered 2025, still embroiled in its war against Ukraine. The United States had a new president in Donald Trump, a man whom Putin thought he could manipulate. Russia would play on what it thought were Trump's anti-NATO sentiments to get what it wants: Ukrainian territory, a new multipolar world order, and eventually the end of Ukraine itself. However, Putin miscalculated. Through failed peace negotiations and his own threatening actions, Putin tried to break NATO. But now Russia is falling apart, and the US is proving its membership in NATO isn't going anywhere. In recent months, Putin has taken two courses of action, both of which were designed to damage NATO, but have blown up in his face. The first of these actions has been ongoing for much of 2025, Russia's refusal to come to peace terms with Ukraine. There has been talk of peace, of course. Putin has even been able to use these negotiations to thaw the ice between the US and Russia, leading to telephone and even face-to-face conversations with Trump. But through it all, Putin's position hasn't changed. Russia's leader won't compromise. The same maximalist demands Putin has had since the start of the Ukraine invasion are still in place. The Eurasia Daily Monitor's Pavel Bayev makes it clear in a September 22nd piece, in which he points out that peace talks have seemingly come to a standstill. Bayev says that Putin's journey to meet Trump in Alaska initially provided a spike of hope, at least in some quarters, of a peace deal inching closer to being reached. But now, whatever happened during these talks is at a dead end, and it's all thanks to Putin. By refusing to depart from his maximalist demands and rejecting Trump's offer of compromise, Putin has committed to an indefinite continuation of the war, a choice that may be a mistake as grave as his decision to launch the full-scale invasion in February 24, 2022, Bayev writes. Those demands have been undermining peace talks all year, Bayev says, this time writing for the Peace Research Institute Oslo back in June. Putin would often keep Russia's demands secret in the lead-up to meetings that might bring a peace agreement closer. In every case, the news after the fact would always be that Putin has made the same unreasonable requests that would not only eliminate Ukraine as a threat, but also allow Russia to prevent what it says is a NATO expansion onto Russia's borders. Among Putin's requests is that the West cease all military aid to Ukraine. Of course, that only benefits Russia, as it means that Putin's forces will be able to actually carry out their attritional campaign that likely would have led to the fall of Ukraine early in the war, were it not for Western intervention. Bayev points out that Putin is demanding an end to Ukrainian military mobilization and that he appears to want Ukraine to keep only a small army. Not coincidentally, a small Ukrainian military would be easier to overrun in the future, when Putin inevitably breaks any peace deal created on his terms. But far and away the most egregious of Putin's demands was reported by The Guardian on August 16th. In the wake of Putin's Alaska meeting with Trump, Russia's mood was nothing short of jubilant. The meeting proved that negotiations are possible without preconditions, the Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev blared in the aftermath. So confident was Putin in the seeming success of this meeting that he once again made a demand that he's been making since he launched his invasion. Ukraine has to give up Luhansk and Donetsk. Both parts of the Donbas region, Luhansk and Donetsk, are clear targets for Putin. Russia already claims to control almost all of the former territory, with the latter being subjected to a summer offensive centered on the fortress city of Pokrovsk. Speaking of fortresses, Donetsk is also home to Ukraine's Fortress Belt, which is a series of cities that have turned into death traps for Russian forces. Putin and his soldiers are struggling to take these oblasts by force. So Putin chances his arm at the negotiating table by making demands that Ukraine cede Luhansk and Donetsk, as though anybody, especially NATO, would ever believe that Putin would be happy to stop at those two oblasts. Russia's president knows that Ukraine is never going to agree to those demands. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made that clear several times. Even if Zelensky has the inclination to cede those territories, which he doesn't, Ukraine's president doesn't have the power to do so. The country's constitution makes it illegal for Zelensky to cede any Ukrainian territory, which is one of the reasons why Ukraine is fighting so hard to retake Crimea over a decade after Russia annexed the peninsula. The goal here from Putin's end is to make impossible demands that he knows Ukraine can't meet. Part of this is about manipulation. Ukraine's refusals allow Putin to claim that it's not Russia that doesn't want peace. It's Ukraine. NATO is smart enough to see through that paper-thin charade. It also knows that the real reason why Putin makes these types of impossible demands is that he wants to keep the war going indefinitely, just as Bayev says. An indefinite war drains Ukraine. It also drains NATO nations, which continue to support Ukraine financially and with military assistance, all while preparing for their own potential future conflicts with Russia. Putin's constant refusal to make peace has achieved nothing more than earning Russia the ire of a collective defense organization that is already wary of what the Russian president's expansionist ambitions could mean for Europe. But that alone might not have been enough to kickstart NATO action, but Putin had to take things a step further, so he started making more regular incursions onto NATO territory. September 2025 will end up being a month more recognized for what Russia has been doing outside of Ukraine in the wake of its failed summer offensive than anything that the country achieves inside Ukraine. Russia kicked off what became a pattern of aerial incursions on September 10th, when it sent 19 of its drones into Poland's airspace. Poland, like every other nation we're about to mention in this section of the video, is a NATO member. Some of these drones were shot down, and none ended up presenting a real threat. Still, it's clear that Putin wanted to push some buttons to see just how far he could push before NATO delivered a major response. The button pushing has continued through September. Sweden was forced to intercept 2 Su-30 fighter jets armed with anti-radiation missiles, with Denmark also intercepting an Il-20 signals intelligence plane. Both interceptions occurred over neutral territory above the Baltic Sea on September 14th, but neutral doesn't mean much in this instance. There is no reason for these types of planes to be flying over the Baltic region other than to represent a threat to NATO nations, such as Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, and Estonia, that have coasts on the Baltic Sea. Remember, Estonia will be coming back to it pretty soon. Also on September 14th, Bayev writes for the Eurasia Daily Monitor, a Russian Garand drone somehow made its way into Romania. That drone didn't do much, but it still entered NATO airspace, deliberately or otherwise. And on September 21st, Germany and Sweden were forced to scramble fighter jets to once again escort an Il-20 out of neutral territory above the Baltic Sea. All of this was happening against the backdrop of Russia and Belarus conducting their joint Zapad 2025 exercises, with some of the training taking place practically on the border Belarus shares with Ukraine, the same border Belarus allowed Putin to use when he launched his initial invasion back in February 2022. Then there's what happened in Estonian airspace. On September 19th, Estonia reported that Russia had sent a trio of MiG-31 fighter jets into its airspace. All 3 of those jets deviated from what was meant to be a routine flight path between Russia and the Kaliningrad exclave. Like the aircraft we've mentioned before, these MiG-31s had no reason to be in Baltic airspace, and certainly no legitimate reason to enter the airspace of yet another NATO member. Those fighter jets were given warnings, to which they failed to reply. Within 12 minutes of them being detected, NATO jets were in the air and escorting Russia's fighters away. The incident rattled enough cages inside NATO that several people are now calling for NATO to institute a rule under which the organization can shoot down any Russian military aircraft that encroaches its airspace. We cover those calls for more action in a recent video, so check it out to learn more. What we see here are tests. Putin, having already angered NATO with this constant refusal to offer serious peace terms to Ukraine, is now trying to figure out where NATO's line is. So far, these tests have led to some strong rebukes from various NATO members. NBC shares a typical response from the UK's Foreign Minister Yvette Cooper, who said, "Your reckless actions risk direct armed confrontation between NATO and Russia. Our alliance is defensive, but be under no illusion. We stand ready to defend NATO's skies and NATO's territory. If we need to confront planes operating in NATO space without permission, then we will do so." Russia claimed that words like these were both groundless and hysterical, but the reality is that it's all part of Putin's plan to break NATO. However, it's a plan that isn't quite going how Putin wanted. If all that NATO delivered in the wake of these incidents were verbal rebukes and no action, Putin would have been satisfied. He could keep on pushing, perhaps sending jets deeper into NATO airspace, all while continuing to wage his Ukraine war as he makes false claims of wanting peace. But NATO is doing much more. The organization is both formulating direct responses to Russia's increasingly aggressive actions and, thanks to Putin's failure to bring Trump over to Russia's side, is working toward destroying Russia within. On the immediate action side of things, we see the beginnings of this in how NATO has reacted to all of the aerial incursions we've already spoken about in this video. Bayev calls the incursion over Estonia a key test that proved NATO could respond to an incoming Russian threat in a matter of minutes. The instant demonstration of European solidarity to Russian aggression toward NATO and US President Donald Trump's reference to big trouble proved Putin's assumption of the feebleness of Western resolve wrong, Bayev writes. He's referring to Trump's comments that there could be big trouble if Russia tried to pull the same kind of trick again. Interestingly, Newsweek reported on September 23rd that Trump has also added his voice to those in NATO who say that the organization should shoot down Russia's fighter jets when they enter NATO territory. Trump was asked whether NATO should do just that by a reporter as he met Zelensky, and he responded with 3 words, "Yes, I do." The speed of that NATO response, along with the calls for stronger responses in the future, isn't what Putin expected. He thought he could project Russian power while only getting a slap on the wrist. Instead, he's receiving threats that future Russian jets entering NATO airspace will be shot down, with the US being part of that particular charge. Any vision that Putin had of creating a new, multipolar world where the US and Russia would work side by side has come crumbling down around him. But we'll get to that in a moment. NATO has also delivered a harsh warning in an official statement covering the recent airspace incursions. In that statement, NATO said that the incursions are part of a clear pattern, meaning Russia's denials of intent are falling on deaf ears. Russia should be in no doubt. NATO and allies will employ, in accordance with international law, all necessary military and non-military tools to defend ourselves and deter all threats from all directions. We will continue to respond in the manner, timing, and domain of our choosing. Our commitment to Article 5 is ironclad, the statement reads. There are a couple of things that Putin really wouldn't have wanted to see here. First, NATO specifies that it will use all necessary military tools as well as non-military tools to defend itself. That's open-ended enough to lend some credence to the idea that NATO will support any of its members that decide to shoot down the next Russian jet that enters their airspace. The mention of an ironclad commitment to Article 5 will also give Putin pause for thought. This is confirmation that all of NATO, including the US, will respond if any member triggers that article. NATO isn't divided, as Putin hoped it would be after all his peace talk machinations. There are no ifs or maybes coming out of the NATO camp regarding where Putin really stands with Ukraine and, by extension, where he stands when it comes to NATO. This reaffirmation of Article 5 sends a clear message to Russia's leader. If you come for one of us, you come for all of us. NATO also mentions something else in the statement: Eastern Sentry. 2 days after Russia sent its drones into Poland's airspace, NATO launched the Eastern Sentry program, which is designed to strengthen the NATO posture across the entire eastern flank. This is the flank through which Russia would have to break if it has designs on nations like Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. What NATO is doing here is showing Russia that these nations, some of which are among the weakest in NATO in terms of their pure military power, won't be left undefended. Eastern Sentry is touched on in another official NATO release where the organization goes into detail on what its eastern defenses already look like. Multinational battle groups had already been established in Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, with all of those groups now about to be bolstered. NATO's members are also sending more ships and planes to what could be the first major front of a war with Russia, along with more soldiers. This is not the feeble NATO response Putin hoped for. It's NATO standing up to Russia and declaring that it's ready for a fight. Building on all of this comes the Eastern Sentry, announced by NATO's Secretary-General Mark Rutte and Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Alexis G. Grinkovich. The new program gives the eastern flank a boost in every sense of the word. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, or RFERL, details this in a September 22nd article. NATO is now moving toward an integrated system of air policing that will allow its members to provide rapid supplementary support to any NATO nation that comes under threat of a Russian aerial attack. The idea now is to have more resources linked to each other across the entire eastern flank, be it missiles or anti-drone technology, RFERL says. It's inspired by a similar operation, Baltic Sentry, that was launched earlier this year as a response to the number of alleged undersea sabotage activities by Moscow in the Baltic Sea. RFERL also reveals that several countries have joined Eastern Sentry, placing military assets at Grinkovich's disposal so he can use them however he sees fit. There's a trio of Rafale fighter jets coming from France. Poland has provided an Airbus A400M military transport aircraft. Germany is offering 4 of its Eurofighters, and the UK is going to provide some of its Typhoon fighter jets. Denmark and Italy will also provide fighter jets, RFERL says, with Denmark also having sent a military ship into the Baltic Sea. The Czech Republic, Spain, and Sweden round out those who've made commitments under Eastern Sentry. The former of these 3 has also sent a trio of helicopters and some of its special forces troops into Poland. This is NATO unity on a scale Putin hoped he would never see. Russia's leader pushed buttons, and he got answers when it came to how prepared NATO is to defend itself against Russia. We come back to the multipolar world point we made earlier. In his Eurasia Daily Monitor piece, Bayev notes that the jubilant tone that pervaded Russia after Putin's Alaska meeting with Trump has soured. Just a few weeks ago, hopes were high that Trump would help Russia to form what Bayev calls a multipolar world following that summit. The Kyiv Independent reveals what this would look like, noting that we've lived in a bipolar world since the end of World War II. It's been East versus West ever since, with Russia and later China being the power players on the eastern side. For the West, the US has always been the most powerful threat, though NATO as a collective is perhaps even more so as long as the US is involved. In a multipolar world, Russia, China, and the US would share somewhat equal influence in their own spheres, with all of the other countries in their respective regions having to fall in line. For Russia, this would mean the country becomes the main geopolitical power in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the periphery, the Kyiv Independent says. That world isn't happening now. US support for NATO now appears absolute. The tone of Russian commentary has shifted to asserting that the Third World War is already progressing, but that hostilities are primarily economic, Bayev writes. And it's in this economic war that NATO may be able to destroy Russia from the inside as it's preparing for a war on its eastern flank. You see, Putin has some major financial problems inside Russia. Bayev says that Russia's leader sees the military-industrial complex he's created since he invaded Ukraine as just Russia's main economic driver. That complex's rapid expansion during the first few years of the invasion fed into this view, as it allowed Russia to post impressive economic growth figures, such as the 4.3% gross domestic product growth it claimed for 2024. However, military-industrial complexes can't provide growth forever. By their nature, such economies force a single-minded focus that is to the extreme detriment of any other industry that would have previously contributed to growth. Bayev puts it succinctly, stating that the military-industrial complex's overgrowth, however, fueled by state funding and unlimited credit, depresses every other sector in the economy and guarantees a crisis when the war-driven expenditures are reduced. It's here where Putin's refusal to take peace discussions seriously come back into play. Putin seems to want a perpetual war, first with Ukraine and then with NATO. What Russia's leader doesn't yet seem to realize is that the wartime economy he's created, which delivered such a powerful illusion of growth initially, has now become the albatross around Russia's neck. As The Economist puts it, the economic party of 2023-24 is most definitely over. What's left is an economy that's clinging to life. For NATO, that means the organization can simply wait for Putin to exhaust Russia's resources while crippling the country's economy. NATO doesn't want perpetual war. In an ideal world, Russia would leave Ukraine today and end its expansionist campaign. But if perpetual war is what Putin wants, NATO is united in its support of Ukraine and ready to fight if Russia somehow achieves a victory. Eventually, the damaging wartime economy is going to catch up to Russia, leaving it a shell of its former self. Perhaps that end might end up meaning that NATO achieves victory without having to fight, as Russia destroys itself from within. Still, Putin continues to develop plans to launch a war against NATO. And now intelligence has revealed a little more about what those plans look like, meaning NATO has to prepare. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering NATO's responses to Russian aggression. And thank you, as always, for watching.